McKinsey Report, open source technology in the age of GenAI or AI. So this is actually GenAI models that are open source, not open source being generated by GenAI models. That's the thing. That's the distinction that we need to make. I'm not sure the original LinkedIn post actually made that clear because it was by somebody else that I picked up on. It wasn't by McKinsey themselves, but certainly that's what the McKinsey report is about. So for me, just one slightly cynical point to make on this is, I think the open source sort of community has finally managed to make itself important again. It was kind of waning off a little bit there, and then GenAI sort of happened. They were in a panic last year about it. I attended the State of Open Con last year, 2024, SUCon conference in London. And I tell you, you should have seen the panic on people's faces at that conference. They had no idea what GenAI was. They had no idea what their role was within it. Everybody was kind of panicking. Were they going to lose their jobs? Was GenAI going to replace them because of things like the co-pilots and things like that in GitHub and what have you. So yeah, there was a real panic about in the open source communities of whether they were going to be kind of irrelevant really in this sort of GenAI sort of era. But it looks like they've managed to save themselves. I really, I just kind of found it a little bit, slightly pathetic really, that they were kind of in that kind of panic about it. And then every single post that I saw around open source was open source with AI, Kubernetes with AI, blah 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 with GenAI. Everything that they were doing from then on was around that. So I don't know. I just found that a little bit slightly pathetic, to be honest with you, in regards to that. And then I started seeing the influencers, the so-called influencers in that space, again in the open source space, all talking about again how you do GenAI. Like I said, a lot of these posts were sort of around doing open source with GenAI. So that's kind of my first impression from what was happening, what's kind of really led us to where we are today, where a lot of the GenAI models that are being released are open source based.
Yeah, I mean, the report was reasonably well put together. I didn't have many problems with the report itself, the numbers of people and who they were talking to. I don't think it said anything that we're going to find particularly earth-shattering about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the one that came out, there was a couple of things for me that came out particularly. The first was that the biggest use of open source was amongst the in the tools, and you go, yeah, almost no shit, Sherlock. I mean, it's because we've had these conversations before that says open source is most effective for developers developing new tools. That's where an awful lot of open source has sort of sprung up from.
Yeah, exactly.
And is used, and it's a great environment, a great ecosystem for getting new developments and innovations quickly to into the market. I was going to say to market. I'll come back to that. I think it's but getting them into being used because of the developers, and it was noticeable every response to the questions that McKinsey were putting out to their audience. The importance declined as you went further along the development life cycle. You got down to inference at the far end,
right?
And the use of open source was much smaller. I mean, it's still fairly significant. Don't get me wrong, but
yeah.
So I think there was an element of open source has a role to play here, guys, up front. But I mean, there was an interesting comment It was a guy called Vilas S. Dar, president of J. McGovern Foundation. And I haven't had a chance to look up
To
what
look
the
at what
Patrick
that
J.
is.
McGovern Foundation actually
Yeah,
is. But he
yeah,
ended up, the future of AI belongs to ecosystems, not empires. And you just thought, actually, you're going to be seriously, upset and sort of in the future,
yeah.
because again, as we've talked about in the past, open source is most active in something really new
Mm.
before the empires have actually realized there's a revolution going on.
Yes,
And you get
yes,
the Empire Strikes Back, and all of a
yeah,
sudden, the bad guys have suddenly bought all the open source, tools and
yes.
vendors and God knows what, So, um,
And that's
yes,
happened already because all of the names that we know, like Mistral, Anthropic, and so on, have all had
yeah,
investments from the hyperscalers
yeah, yeah. It's with
and OpenAI, of course.
yeah, and so there's maybe we get well, we know we're cynical,
Oh yeah,
certainly old so and so's. Well, I'm old. You're not so old,
getting there.
but getting there. But it's
Yeah.
it's a sort of almost like a natural evolution that
Yes.
that and there's a certain cynicism amongst the or opportunism amongst large scale enterprise, whether
Mm.
that's the hyperscalers or it's Meta. I mean, Meta were one of the worst examples of using open source and
Mm.
then effectively closing it off for its own particular
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
And they can see it's great. I've got all these people who are doing stuff without me having to pay them.
Yes.
And I can sit back and wait until I see whether it's going to work and whether it's potential for making money, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So I think and I don't think this is any different. And it's the way of the world. And let's not get sort of too starry-eyed about it or too cynical about it. That is just the way of the world. So I think, yes, it's on the same sort of curve as a lot of other technologies are that, in the early days when the big companies either can't see where it's going or can see where it's going, but think they'll wait to jump in.
Yeah.
That's where we're at with AI, I think. Yeah, certainly the tool sets.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I just found the, and we'll get to the kind of some of the details of the report in a minute, but just that sort of open source community just seemed to be in a panic last year. And then they kind of, try to make themselves as relevant as they can by pushing out all this stuff. And you can run all your GenAI stuff, all your open source GenAI models on on top of open source platforms. And now the CNCF has kind of really waded in as well. Lots of projects that they're supporting and having under their wing are have AI in mind, or they're geared towards sort of AI models and things like that. I mean, my point always remains that GenAI and this kind of more recent GenAI revolution, it's whether you're kind of doing the pre-training or the inference side, GenAI is essentially an HPC workload. Yeah, it doesn't need to be open source. It doesn't need Kubernetes. It doesn't need any virtualization. It doesn't need anything. It's you basically run it as close to the bare metal as you can. Obviously, that's not always possible. The likes of OpenAI have used Azure, for example, to do their research on ChatGPT in the past and so on. And that was part of the main investment that Microsoft did back in, I think, 2018
But they
or
would still
2019.
use as close to the bare metal even in that environment. I mean,
Well, yeah, technically, but I mean, it's not the same as running an operating system and putting the GenAI app on top of it on a Dell server, for example. You're not going to get any closer to that, whether you're a cloud or a hypervisor or Kubernetes or OpenShift or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. You're not going to get any closer to that,
no.
In any other shape or form. So, yeah, it's an HPC workload. It doesn't need to be. First of all, it does not need to be open sourced, and we can see that OpenAI is doing very well without open sourcing any of their models. I think they've kind of skirted around the edges of that, and some people have said, "Oh yeah, we should open source it," but not necessarily, have actually done that. Now, the others you mentioned, Meta, with Llama and so on, they're doing that because they're all late to the game. They're all playing catch up, and a good way for, if you're late to the game, is open source your model, or at least open source one of the models, hopefully create an ecosystem around it, and then people start using your model and not somebody else's. Now, clearly for Meta that hasn't worked, and clearly for, again, Google and all the others, it hasn't worked because the majority of users, if you look at some of the charts in terms of usage and subscription and API calls that are being made from AI code and AI agents, is through to OpenAI's platforms, so ChatGPT namely, and so on. But that is, I think, the idea of why we've seen a proliferation of open source Gen AI models, or Gen AI models that are open sourced and available. The other point I want to make, which I think the report doesn't really pick up on a lot, which is unfortunate and a little bit disappointing, is the fact that some of these so-called open source models are not really open source as in the Linux OS open source license type. They're of a different kind. And certainly, I think some of the Llama models have been criticized recently. I'll try and pick up some info on this, by the way, which I'm sure I do have somewhere, and include that in the description of the video. So have a look at that. So that's been one of the criticisms, is that people are calling them, Gen AI open source models, but they're not necessarily that. And again, that's been something that some people have actually picked up on, to the point where some people say, if you're going to run the model, run it in your own data center or in your own private cloud or whatever, and don't put it out in a public cloud or use somebody else's tool and things like that. Now, that in itself has its own impact, because not everybody can train their own model. Not everybody can fine-tune their own model as well, which goes back to the report that I actually wrote last year. And I was trying to get that out as quickly as I could. Again, I'll try and include a link in the description of the video to that report, which was about where you're going to run your Gen AI model, essentially. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, one of the things that I've seen, in that this kind of vanity and hypocrisy of, everything has to be open sourced, and we need to, have control over Gen AI models and force people to make them open source. Well, like I said, OpenAI doesn't care about doing that, and they're doing very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, one of the things that the report intrigued me, and it leaves us sort of questions to be asked, is that the audience that they asked, I mean, there was about 800, 800 or 900 responses that they asked, and there was quite a broad cross section that they didn't really break down how many of those were out and out technical people, how many, because a CIO can be technical or can be very business oriented, we know that. And to an extent, a lot of these titles get misused anyway. Even CTOs like yourself. I know you're very technical, but you come across some, you think they're more like a CIO than a CTO. And so one of the challenges of all the responses was that if you go into the report, they do these sort of bar charts for each of the sort of questions they asked. And you get the one color is the people who agree with the question, and the other is they disagree with the question.
Yeah.
But there's a bit in the middle that's blank, and and they actually put it's no preference or don't know.
Yeah.
And you think actually it's quite large percentages of that. So and my challenge, again as an analyst, is to come back and say, well, if you're talking about tech leaders say that open source AI models are less costly to deploy than proprietary AI models are, but lag behind them in time to value. Interesting. 60% said has lower cost implementation. And all of a sudden you think, yeah, but if you then break that down and say, it's the people who are actually running it, or is this the perception of business leaders, the more, further up the tree.
Mm.
That report didn't go into this. So you get a slightly misleading, everybody's saying it's 60% more cheaper to run, open source models than proprietary models.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you left thinking, I need to dig in further, and I'd love to have seen a breakdown of answers because as it was, you're wondering what of that 60%, how many of those were either the techies at one end or the business people at the other end of the spectrum
Right.
people they'd asked,
Yeah.
and it's not clear. But there weren't, there weren't a lot of really contentious issues. I think it was, mostly what you'd expect to see. That at the model, building stage, they were a lot of open source. But when you get the further you got into running them, as you say, on the infrastructure or
Yeah.
using inferencing, the one that intrigued me was modification, and I'm not quite sure what they meant by modification. There's one set of
Okay.
where the lowest, if you like, acceptance of open source was where people had to do modifications.
Oh, okay. So that might be, so, a model's open source, and then you have to tweak it to kind of make it a bit more proprietary for you, maybe, or something, or specific for your.
So again, maybe that's not particularly earth-shattering, and maybe that's the reason I sort of took the whole report as not being particularly earth-shattering.
Well, yeah, I mean, most people, I guess, or well, I don't know what the percentage. I'm just saying most as a just arbitrary sort of description, but in certain cases or most cases, not everybody knows what the model is doing inside anyway, what the code of the model is doing, because it was written by somebody else. Just like you're inheriting this open source code, right? And you're going to kind of use it internally. So unless you have, 50 data scientists and ML ops engineers and developers, have experience with AI and GenAI, you're just going to compile the model and use it because it's an open sourcely available model, right? And because you want to do GenAI in your business, but you don't really know what the model is essentially doing. And one of the things I think that was mentioned is the whether the weights are open of the model, the open weights of the model, which refers to the open weights kind of refers to the AI model which is being trained with parameters or weights that are made publicly available. So how it was trained, the data sets and things like that. So that allows you to basically, allows users to access, run, modify, and adapt the models independently of the original training code or any proprietary restrictions. So again, that's GenAI is not just a piece of code that you can just take and then you can read the code and then go, oh yeah, that makes sense and I understand that bit. And it's not that simple. You need the expertise, you need experts who know what the code is doing, who know how a GenAI model and all the techniques. And there's different techniques apart from LLMs. There's different techniques. I was just looking at the chart the other day, which is showing other models, and the person who was posting on it was saying we can't call all of these LLMs because they're not LLMs. The original sort of ChatGPTs are kind of an LLM approach, but there's some of these other newer models are not really LLMs. They're some other kind of LMs. They're large language, they're language models, but they're not necessarily large or something like that. Or they're not necessarily just large language models, for example, and so on. So I think there's a lot more depth to kind of, GenAI open source versus just getting some open source that does a particular function. And I think that's the difficulty, even with the report. It depends on which layer the report is asking the question. As you just said, it could be if the report is within the model, it's kind of looking at within the model, then it's not going to ask those external type questions about open source GenAI models. It's going to be within that space. So it's going to kind of talk within that ecosystem and not look at it from the outside, for example. So it just depends on what really McKinsey's angle was, or their kind of, where did they want to start their reports. Now, I picked up, I wanted to do like a top 5 stats from the report. And yeah, it wasn't kind of remarkable. There was a lot of it was, I don't know, academic, I guess. So, it said widespread use of open source GenAI models. Yeah, 50% of respondents reported that they're leveraging it. Well, they would, because it's not 100%, it's not 95%, because, as I said in my article last year, not everybody's going to want to build their own model. And this goes back to actually what Gartner put out and has been putting out and updating since. Really great chart, by the way, guys. I'll try and include that in the description of the video as well, in terms of whether you do a build or buy when it comes to your model. And I think you and I have spoken in the past and said, not everybody's going to want to build and fine tune and RAG their own model, because they're not a tech company. They're we sell apples and oranges, right? And I do want to use AI. So how do I do that? Well, I'll just use like a SaaS model instead. So that's why this one said, the respondents, only 50% of the respondents said that they leverage open source technologies for the AI tech stack.
Yeah, one of the ones, the particular stat that sort of took my attention, say that when talking about tech leaders, say that open source AI models are less costly to deploy than proprietary AI models, but lag behind them in time to value. And you look down to has a faster time to value ratio. And it's certainly the biggest negative response, 48% saying it takes longer. But I think that just backs up what what you've just been highlighting, is that an awful lot of organizations out there, want to get the benefits out of this thing. And the quickest way to getting benefits is to use a model that's already been developed for their line of business, with things in mind, where any modifications, any RAG, that needs to go on is fairly small to get it to do what they need to do to get the value out of it. Because you can imagine, industry leaders saying, are we going to let our developers spend another year, developing the most fancy models?
Yeah.
Something that actually we only need an 80% answer to, and I think that's normal. But to take our own medicine, as it were, that we sort of said, we should be asking where people are coming from, because McKinsey's reason for doing this is to get more consulting revenue.
Well, yeah.
So
Exactly.
they don't want to give you all the answers. They want to make it, so what's the issue here? Oh, well, I'm going to have to ask McKinsey, and that's us being, particularly cynical, but that's it. If you've given this to a university that says, right, do it as a project, I think you'd have got not different answers maybe, but much more detailed breakdown that enabled you to say, okay, in my particular instance, this is the important thing, not that. And that was the problem with this. McKinsey, enough for it to be interesting, but not enough to say, oh, I can now use that without going back to McKinsey to say, well, how do I do something? I think so if you're being cynical, that's...
Well, yeah. I mean, some of the other stats include things like, sector leadership. So you have, technology, of course, media, telco. 70% of respondents said they're using it. Cost benefits of open source, 60% of respondents indicated that open source GenAI results in lower implementation costs, as you said. Developer valuation of open source, significant. 81% of developers stated that experience with open source AI tools is highly valued in their field. Well, yeah, because it's saving you writing a lot of code and going to dodgy websites and downloading code that's going to run some Bitcoin mining in the background or something. That was the whole point of things like DevSecOps. And then the last one I picked up on was growth outlook. Approximately 75% of respondents expect their organizations to increase their use of open source AI technologies over the next few years, signaling strong future momentum for open source in AI? Well, strong momentum in Gen AI in general, not just open source in AI or Gen AI, including things like AI SaaS, as I call it, kind of the SaaS side of AI, where you just bring your data and your data sets and drop them into, as we said earlier, an existing model, like a law firm. You're not going to get a law firm's not going to sit there and build their own model and fine tune it and rag it and all that kind of thing. They're just going to say, is there like a Salesforce version of
Not
of
until
this?
they don't pick up one of the hallucinations and try and go to
Yeah,
court.
and try and go to court and get sued for it, and then have to defend themselves,
That's
ironically.
happened.
Yeah. So
So
yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
okay, yeah, it's
Yeah. So like I said, the other area, as we said, is kind of the licensing concerns, and not a lot of these, are sort of fully open. They're partially open only, and so on. So that's an area of concern. And then, I mean, the findings, I guess, again, kind of, 50% of organizations actively using open source AI. Okay. What else? We talked about the majority
I,
growth, and so
the
not a lot really in there that was, as we said, earth shattering. I think you said that. So
yeah, I think that was
yeah.
true, but it probably does presage a different conversation you and I need to have
Mm-hmm.
around, we're just starting to see, I mean, Gartner are just describing Gen AI as about to enter the trough of disillusion.
Mm. Well, yeah, if you read the press, certain parties in the press, they actually think that's already happening, and CIOs are
Yeah.
already disappointed.
But I think, when there's an Economist article I've just read, and I'll put my hand up and say I do like The Economist. It's one of my go-to reads. And which probably makes me a centrist dad with a vengeance, but there we go. Um, but I think there is growing evidence, and from this report, the fact that the biggest negative response was around time to value for open source, and yeah, in terms of AI models. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is that the case? And it does seem to be that enterprises, and again, I had a little bit of a problem with the classifications, the business
Mm.
classifications. They were very broad business classifications. And actually, to use a marketing term, how is Gen AI going to cross the chasm inside enterprises?
Mm.
How's it going to get to mass adoption within enterprises? And we talk about use cases, and I know you're going, well, it's a bit hard to talk about use cases when they haven't got any use cases, but you can
Yeah.
define what the use cases need to be for a vertical market. So it's just, I see us having to have this conversation that says,
Yeah.
is GenAI in the trough of disillusion, and what's the, and what's the way out for it, and why is that happening?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think the use cases are very clear cut. It's everything really, but it's all about how do you implement it,
But
and how do you use it.
my point will be, if you think it's everything, it's like, this idea of having widespread knowledge but not so deep technical understanding. Same sort of issue. If you make it everything, you really will, it'll be a much slower process to get it adopted properly. And we can have a separate conversation. Maybe you need another channel, which is the go-to-market channel,
Gen
which
AI go to market channel.
well,
Yeah.
just how do you take stuff to market? How do
Yeah.
you take
Yeah.
new stuff to market? And I
That's
know
always a tricky one, isn't it?
it is a tricky one, hence
And actually, Gen AI is really suffering from that.
it is. It's suffering from the fact that
A
it's saying,
conundrum.
I can do everything. And to which most businesses would go, I'm not really bothered about you doing it. I want you to do this.
Yeah, no. I mean, don't get me wrong. The use cases are that it can do everything. Now, how do you then go about implementing at least one of those things?
Correct.
Is is a
And
completely
which
different
is
ball game.
what are the most important ones to start with?
Yes. So, I
That's
mean,
the
I think you could probably, and AI, Gen AI sort of augmentation has probably answered that question to a degree. So we've seen things like, Microsoft Copilot come into a lot of their tools, for example. So Teams and Word and PowerPoint and whatever, is now augmented. And AI or Gen AI augmentation is one of the sort of levels or layers of kind of how Gen AI proliferates or comes in. So I think there are low-hanging fruits, and augmentation is, I think, certainly one of those. So we've kind of seen one of those use cases already, the augmentation use case of augmenting existing tools and systems, right? I mean, a great one that I was thinking about a long time ago, and I noticed somebody's actually done it now, is putting a Gen AI model as an interface to something that is normally only the domain of experts in that space. And now you can query that system, technology, data, whatever it is, using natural language. You don't need to be a domain expert in that technology, in that platform, or on that data type in order to actually be able to query it and get results out of it. Now you can do it with a Gen AI model and just write in natural language, in NLP. Yeah. So I think there is some very low hanging fruits, but yeah, you're right. There's AI use cases are everywhere, but it depends on how you're going to implement them. And I think, like I said, augmentation is probably the easiest one that's come in already.
I must admit, and not to derail and take this particular section somewhere else, it's probably something we need to come back to, but I don't see augmentation as being a particularly effective use case per se, other than for the people who are trying to develop the models. I'm much more into it's not really going to take off until business starts to show that it's using it in anger and getting productivity improvements as a result. So I mean, augmentation's great, but it's got to then help businesses develop. Because at the moment, the anecdotal evidence is that a lot of business leaders, as opposed to tech leaders, are going, I can't quite work out how it's going to deliver me, how it's going to work for me in my
Yeah.
and we're sort of there, and that's my point. So yes, you can make the tools better, you can have use cases that improve the ability to make the models more effective, make the development of the models easier, all those sort of things. Yeah, absolutely, make them run better. But until business suddenly says, I'm now going to use it to do this, again, we're talking to ourselves. This is a very technical discussion amongst ourselves, saying, "Hey, haven't we got a great tool?" And to the classic response, it's got to be, "Don't tell me what you've built. Tell me why you've built it to make my life easier." And my life, and that's at the business level. And until we do that, this won't cross the chasm. And I'm sorry, I'm now getting you're getting into one of my rants. So
No, I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. I think there is, we can see the use cases, we can see how some of the low-hanging fruits are, but the difficulty now is, you're right, in terms of how we're going to actually implement it to do this thing for us. And where some of those use cases might be generic enough so that you can actually produce like a universal product that does those things, like I don't know, something that to do with onboarding in HR, for example. Others are actually very proprietary to that particular business, and each business is different from the next as well. So you could say chatbots is again one of those low-hanging fruits, but then other stuff that's is more proprietary to a particular business, and you really need to fine tune the model to that particular business process that you're doing, that you want to automate with AI.
But again, you've got I always say there's an 80/20 rule when it comes to business processes. 80% of businesses use what should be a very standard process, and 20% is your unique differentiator in the way you do those particular processes and what you get out of them. And therefore, there is more than enough ability to say, in any business process workflow, I can have some standard ones that run right across businesses, and you have to tailor 20%. Otherwise, you're going to go, I have to tailor. I don't get that standard model. Take it, even as simple as things as like, when is something in and out of stock, and the answer is, there's a physical answer, but to a finance guy, it's a different point in time than it is to the guy in the warehouse who knows exactly when it's out of stock. Yeah. The other guy doesn't until he gets paid. It's one of those. The process for moving the stock is the same. So you can automate that. You really ought to be able to automate that, and you give a different view in on it. And it doesn't matter whether you are a clothes retailer, a food retailer, or a food manufacturer, or a chemicals company. Those processes are the same. The views you have into them give you particular views, and there might be some level of, and there are use cases out there. I mean, if you ever want to go and look at the Zara story, fascinating use case about how they changed the process in supply chain. Really interesting story. So I'm sorry. I mean, I'm drifting away from the sort of technology speak.
No, that's okay. I mean, this is.
But that's the problem. I think the problem that Gen AI in particular and AI in general is, or not so much. No, Gen AI in particular has got is it hasn't worked out how to get the enterprise, how to deliver something to the enterprise. We're still going, hey, I've got this really great thing. It does this, 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 and this. And you listen to the hyperscalers themselves talking about Gen AI, and then listen to an enterprise leader talking about Gen AI, and you're at the complete end of the spectrum. There are people, even Mark Andreessen the other day said, don't give up on Gen AI. Keep the faith, guys. It's going to work. It's going to save us all.
Yeah.
And you're going, yeah, but that doesn't get it implemented.
That's still still got to do the implementation.
Microsoft get up on the stage and go, hey, Gen AI is the way forward. We know, but just anyway, sorry. End of soapbox from me.
End of the soapbox rant. Yeah, no problem. I think I agree largely with what you're saying. So it depends. You mentioned the word level, and I think that's important to keep in terms of at which level we're looking to tackle this. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support me. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. Bye for now.